we live? We are live. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on where you're joining from. If you're here for the Testkube Open Source webinar with Ole Lensmar and myself, you're in the right place. We are going to give a couple of minutes, or maybe like a minute. Ule, what do you think? 1
A
minute?
minute
or
sounds
two?
like a good plan.
Like
Let's start with 1 minute and see where we
Yeah, let's do 60 seconds. I'm a very precise man.
You
So
are.
60 seconds starting now for the rest of the audience to try to trickle in, and so we don't want you to miss one bit of this amazing webinar. In the meantime, I'm going to pass it to you, Ule, with the weather. How
The
is
weather
how are
report
things? Yeah.
from Stockholm, Sweden. Actually, pretty nice. It's a bit cold, still very light. It's like 7 o'clock in the evening, but still pretty light. Going into kind of that period of the year where it's always light when you're awake, which is great.
Do you have like longer days during either the winter or the summer? Like you have like this midnight sun, you don't get it.
We don't get the midnight sun, but it doesn't really get dark. So it kind of in the mid June, it's kind of, I don't know what's the word in English. Dusk is early, but it's kind of, it doesn't really get dark, which is nice. So we're getting there, but it's still pretty cold.
Nice.
Spring is still waiting to make an entrance.
Cool. Well, for anyone wondering, I'm in Orlando, Florida, and today we're 83 and sunny, and it's warm, man. It's warm.
Hey, you were that? Didn't you have that last week?
Yeah, we had a winter of like 2 weeks, and that's it. We survived the freeze here in Orlando, Florida, 2026.
I'm sure that
but cool. Well, I think that was the minute. Thank you so much for the weather, Ule. And to all of you who are joining the webinar today, we're going to discuss Testkube Open Source and all the benefits and all the cool things that you can do with it. But before we get started, I want to give you a couple of housekeeping items. This is your time. We did this session for you, our beautiful audience. So please ask any questions that you may have during the session. There is a couple of methods that you can do that. You can participate in the chat. Just go ahead and put your question in the chat, or also, which I encourage the most, go ahead and put it in the Q&A panel so we can follow up in case that we cannot get to your question right away. So the other thing is that this is going to be available on demand. So in the unlikely case that you need to leave in the middle of the webinar, you can go to testkube.io/resources. You will find all the webinars there that, especially this one, is going to be available on demand, and also any other webinars that we have done in the past, you can go watch there as well. And keep an eye on your email. We're going to be sending some invitations for an upcoming event that we have on May 7th. It's another webinar that Ule and I will be hosting on pretty cool topics that you will not want to miss. And we are also going to be walking through the latest releases or the latest things that we're adding to the Testkube platform in the latest release. So I see people trickling in the audience saying hello, saying all the cool things. So quick agenda today. We're going to give you a quick overview. I like to make a big disclaimer here. We promise a no-nonsense webinar today. This is not a sales pitch. The only reason I like to do a quick overview is because some of you may not know what Testkube is. So we want to give you a quick pass through of what is it that we do and what we are and why do we exist before. So in that way you get context on all the cool things that Ule is going to show you. And then Ule is going to take the time to talk to you about Testkube Open Source. We are going to have a cool demo also in there, and he's going to talk to you about what are the improvements that we have in the open source project, how you can contribute, and also then, as I mentioned, we will have the Q&A. All right, Ule, what do you think? We're good to go?
Sounds amazing. Yeah,
we have people from the Netherlands today.
Yay.
That's so cool. We were there a couple of weeks ago.
We were. I was just talking about Amsterdam here at dinner.
Beautiful.
Good place to go in the summer.
Amazing. I enjoyed my visit there so much. It was fantastic. So, all right. So, as I promised, quick overview. I promise you, 2 minutes, people. So, one of the things that I like to tell anyone when I'm explaining Testkube to them is if you're building something, especially software, if it is important, it must be tested. One of the statistics that I found not too long ago was Forrester saying that most of our organizations lack test coverage. And that could be because of tooling, that could be because of complexity of the applications, or they're trying to move very fast with those two-letter words that we have heard very frequently lately, which is AI. So we have seen it in the news. There are a bunch of bugs that are making it into production, and that is a problem. Now, the reason why testing is getting harder is because first, AI, we know, is not a surprise now. Development is happening with AI, so testing is trying to catch up with it. Cloud native also is a revolution that is making it more complex to handle all the environments. There's multiple environments out there. And DevOps, modern engineering, is also accelerating how production is happening. So everything that is making testing spread across the entire software delivery life cycle. So, Ole, do you want to to paint a little more color on this slide about what is it that it means for us to be testing here and here and here and here?
Well, it means kind of that you're testing there and there. So, sorry. Testing is spread all across the life cycle, right? So, and test-related activities, and we've seen that over many years. This is not really new, right? So you're doing testing as part of while you're coding, you're writing unit tests, you're definitely running tests as part of your builds in your testing phase. We see now as people go to more asynchronous delivery pipelines with GitOps, they do testing as a post when there's a release, before or after they release an artifact to a repository. Obviously, when that artifact might get deployed, they want to do some testing and validate that it works in a staging or an integration environment. And then even as we go into operations or production, we know that people like to run but often run tests like end-to-end tests or just basic safety nets tests in their production environment. And I think this has been driven by shifting left, which is obviously not new, shifting right, which may be a little bit newer, where testing has kind of been focused later in the life cycle. AI is also driving this a lot. Just there's more code out there now, more code being generated, and people are trying to figure out how do we kind of get release confidence for all the code that AI is generating, and which often results in more tests that need to be run. If those tests can be AI generated or not doesn't really matter, but they still kind of clog up your pipelines. And so testing everywhere, which is good. Quality is important.
Exactly. Yeah, quality is important. That I couldn't agree more with that. So, and because of that problem, because we want to solve the quality problem that is happening right now in the delivery lifecycle, that's why we created Testkube, and we're introducing Testkube as the testing platform for modern engineering teams. And the benefit that you get out of this is that you can orchestrate all your testing activities in your pipeline. It is cloud native, meaning that if you're working with Kubernetes, you don't have to go test anywhere else. You're going to test where your application live. And last but not least, it works with all the tools that you already work. So meaning that you're not going to rip and replace and have to learn any new frameworks, which I believe this is magical. So from this point on, I'm going to pass it to Ole. He's going to talk to you about the architecture of Testkube, and then we will go ahead and jump into all the goodness that we're going to talk to you about the open source. Ole, back to you.
Thank you. Great. So one busy slide for you, and then I'll promise it's just bullets. So this is just to kind of give you a high-level Testkube architecture picture before we focus entirely on open source, I promise, well, more or less. Testkube really has two pieces to it. There's a control plane that you can install in your cluster, and there are agents. And the agents are what you also install in your cluster and what are actually running your tests. And the agents themselves are open source, and that's what we're going to talk about earlier. So you can see this as an open core model, or I think like you had in the previous slide. Ultimately, the more agents you have, you might want to orchestrate those and manage those across your organization or infrastructure. You might need more enterprisey features that are provided by the control plane. So this is kind of the duality of the Testkube architecture. And we're going to be focusing more or less on the agents, because that's also where Testkube actually started. Initially, Testkube was just an agent, started as an in-cluster component to run tests inside your Kubernetes infrastructure. And so let's dig into a little bit into that. Here we go. So first of all, what is it? If you're kind of at a high level, you've heard kind of the story around the whole Testkube package. What is Testkube Open Source? So it's really, I'm going to be somewhat engineering technical in these slides. It's a framework for running automated tests inside your Kubernetes clusters. And what that means, or the highlights of that mean that it can execute, so it runs any kind of test inside your clusters. Those could be end-to-end tests, it could be load tests, it could be API tests, security tests, infrastructure tests. It's really whatever that can be automated as a Docker image inside your in Kubernetes can be run as a test by Testkube. You can schedule these tests in a bunch of different ways. So I think the most common is that you might want to trigger them from CI/CD, but we also see very common that you want to trigger these tests on a cron schedule, like run this test every hour or this end-to-end test in my testing environment, once a day. You can trigger them from Kubernetes events. I'll talk more about that later. There's obviously a CLI, there's an API, a bunch of ways to kind of trigger those tests. So kind of decoupling a little bit the triggering that you would have traditionally if you run your tests inside CI/CD. Breaking them out and letting Testkube manage them, the test executions, makes it also much more, gives you much more flexibility on how those tests are run when they're run. I'll get back to that again. Observe your tests. So Testkube automatically captures all the logs and the results and the artifacts from the test that it runs into a storage layer that it has, and those are then available through the corresponding CLI commands for you to retrieve. So once again, compared to maybe CI/CD, those different logs and artifacts won't be spread out across pipelines. They'll all, or build logs, they'll all be in one place. And you can obviously use those logs then for troubleshooting and reporting and analysis, whatever you might want to do with them. Of course, you can integrate Testkube into the tooling and the ecosystem that you already have. A CLI that can be easily automated in CI/CD. There's webhooks in Testkube that can push data into whatever system you might have. There are plugins, purpose-built plugins for a couple of tools on the market I'll talk about. And there's a REST API, which is reasonably well documented on our website, and which allows you to automate most of the functionality that is also available through the CLI. Yeah, here's some of the tools that we know users are integrating Testkube with. Once again, CI/CD, I'm sure is the most common, but pushing results to Slack or to Teams, or creating issues in Jira, or creating an alert in PagerDuty, pushing results to Datadog for analysis, Prometheus, Backstage, etc., etc. So there's a bunch of ways you can kind of integrate Testkube into the ecosystem of tools that you already have in your Kubernetes infrastructure. I'd like to also talk about what it's not, because that can sometimes be a confusion and we get questions about this. So Testkube is not a testing tool. It provides an execution engine that runs your existing tests scripts. So really important, people come to us and say, hey, if I want to use Testkube, do I have to rewrite all my tests? We say, no, you just continue leveraging the tests that you have, and we'll make sure that they run as efficiently as possible inside your Kubernetes environment. It's not a CI/CD tool. It's a tool that complements CI/CD with continuous testing, CT capabilities, right? So people who are adopting Testkube open source, they don't get rid of GitHub Actions or Jenkins, but what they do is that they augment their pipelines in those tools to use Testkube to run their tests, which gives them a bunch of other benefits that I'll also get back to a little bit later on. So it's a complement to CI/CD. It's not a replacement. It's not an analytics tool. It doesn't do reporting or analysis or anything like that. It's a dumb storage of test results. I'm not talking about open source now, not the commercial offering. So if you want to do more advanced analysis over time, or whatever you might want, you'll have to extract that data from Testkube and push it into some other system, or manage it, analyze it in some other way. And finally, I'll point this out. It's not a dashboard. Testkube Open Source does not have a visual interface. Some of you might know that it used to about 2 years ago, which is no longer part of the product. The primary way to interact with Testkube Open Source is through CLI and through the REST API that it provides. And that, that goes a long way for all our open source users, of course. So then, some of you might be thinking, okay, why would I use Testkube to run my tests? For example, in CI/CD, I already have it all automated up in Jenkins, GitHub Actions, GitLab, etc., etc. Well, there's a bunch of reasons why we think running tests with Testkube is better than those options. One is Testkube is test tool or testing type and vendor agnostic, right? You can run any kind of test inside your cluster. And since it's running in your cluster, you also have leveraging the scalability of Kubernetes itself, right? So if you're running tests that require a lot of resources, or you need to scale out, you need to run a lot of tests at the same time, the Testkube is not going to enforce any constraints on that. It's going to be whatever resources Kubernetes has at its availability in that case. So the scalability is constrained by Kubernetes. And as you know, Kubernetes is great for scaling workloads, which of course includes testing workloads. It's secure in the sense that tests are running in your cluster. If you want to test an in-cluster component, you don't need to be opening up network access from the outside. Also, a lot of our users use this for infrastructure testing. So if you want to validate low-level constructs inside your Kubernetes infrastructure, that's easily done if you're in Kubernetes, right? So that's also another. Consistency is an important thing. I'm sure you've had this situation where, okay, the test passes locally in my dev environment, but it fails in my pipeline. When you're running tests through Testkube, they're always running in Kubernetes, and obviously you might have different distributions of Kubernetes, different versions, but the main framework that they're running is always the same, and this at least doesn't maybe entirely remove the consistency concern that I alluded to earlier, but it makes it much, much smaller, right? You can run Kubernetes on your local machine with Minikube or Kind, and obviously you can spin up clusters in your CI/CD pipelines using vCluster or Minikube Kind again. Of course, you might have production or development clusters also running Kubernetes, so your test cubes will be running in a very similar way. Decoupled from CI/CD, this is really important, and this was actually the original reason we built Testkube, is that I was at another testing company, SmartBear, where we also built testing tools. And one thing that was very evident is that testers were frustrated by having to tying their tests to a CI/CD build. And at the time, it was maybe Jenkins or GitHub Actions, well, maybe. And if a tester wanted to say, hey, I want to rerun this test, or can we run this test on a schedule or whatever, it was pretty awkward to do that. With Testkube, you're totally free to run tests whenever you want, and it has a bunch of ways to trigger and schedule those. You can, as I said before, you can still trigger them from CI/CD, so we're not removing that. We're just giving you more flexibility. Centralized in the context of all your test results are in one place, right? Regardless if those tests were triggered from CI/CD, on a schedule, on test triggers, whatever, all the results will be in one place for you to retrieve. And it's cloud native. It aligns with Kubernetes. It has GitOps principles. I'll show you that it uses CRDs to define its core constructs. It's kind of very friendly in a Kubernetes environment. And it's also kind of one of the original core principles when we built the product. I am going to touch on commercial because you may be wondering, okay, this is all great. So what else is there? Why is there a commercial offering? So Testkube Commercial is really a multi-cluster test orchestration platform, while Testkube Open Source is a single cluster test execution framework. And Testkube Commercial is really for scaling testing across the enterprise, right? So first of all, it has a dashboard with access controls. It provides multi-cluster test orchestration. It has a bunch of functionality around parallelization, sharding, et cetera, analytics, reporting, flakiness detection, RBAC, SSO. There's a bunch of features. There's a bunch of AI functionality as well. A bunch of features in the commercial offering that that speak to the enterprise and as the product scales across the enterprise. And I think we have this nice picture showing basically if you have the progression here, and this is a very common progression for our also commercial customers. They start in a smaller team, a basic CI/CD. They start with open source, and as the team grows, as they run more and more tests, and as they have more needs around maybe SSO or RBAC, not everyone should be able to see all test results, et cetera, the scaling up and the enterprise functionality in commercial is appealing. So which one is for you? Depends really where you are, right? If you're running tests in a single cluster, there we go. You're a small team, or if you just want to evaluate the core engine of Testkube, which is the same, right? For, as you saw in the architecture picture, the agent, open source agent is also what's used by the commercial control plane. That could be a great starting point. And then as you want to start scaling out, you want to run tests across multiple clusters, all the kind of features related to scaling out testing across an enterprise. That's where commercial comes in. Okay, I think that's I'm probably all I'm going to say about commercial. Maybe it'll come up with some of the questions. We'll see. Okay, let's look at just the core components of a Testkube open source installation. First of all, there's a CLI, which you can install with Brew or other tools. The CLI is actually a kubectl plugin, so you can run it with kubectl, or you can just run it as a standalone tool. There's the Testkube open source agent, which is what's installed in your cluster, either with the CLI or there's a Helm chart that you can use. And that then contains the Kubernetes CRDs and controllers, an API server that exposes the REST API, a workflow execution runtime, which is actually what runs the tests that you define, and a storage layer, which is based on MongoDB and Postgres and MinIO, and an event layer using NATS. And so if we look at I'll show you a Testkube installation locally, just running under kind. A little bit further down, you'll see the actual pods running in my cluster. So it's a pretty lightweight installation. The heavy lifting is usually done by the tests themselves, which as they run. There's a bunch of so this was kind of the core tenants, so the CLI and the agent. There are a bunch of other components in the ecosystem that are also open source. So there's a GitHub Action that helps you automate the CLI in your GitHub Action workflows. There's a Backstage plugin. So if you're using Backstage as a developer portal, you can visualize test executions and results in Backstage. There's a workflow marketplace. So we have a marketplace on GitHub where you can share your workflows for infrastructure testing. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later down the presentation. And there's also a Tilt setup for local development. So if you're using, if you're familiar with Tilt, it's a tool to help, it's an open source tool, help you with local development loops under Kubernetes and Docker. And we also have a specialized version of that to help you with local development of both tests and dev when you're using Testkubes. So I'll get back to some of these. I'm going to show any of this. I'll show the marketplace briefly when we get there. Okay, Lucio.
I am back.
I saw you.
Thank you. No, I promised the audience that they could actually go ahead and interrupt us. So I know we're about to jump into some components and also some examples, but I think there is a very cool question here that we have from, I'm going to say Christian, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. I think right now is a very appropriate time to address at least the first one, and is where do we draw the line on what to do with Testkube versus CI/CD pipelines? So can you elaborate a little bit more of that? And I think the question is like, I have testing going on in CI/CD. When do I say, hey, CI/CD is not enough or shouldn't be used for testing? Let me go ahead and start using Testkube.
Well, it's a great question. So let's go back. I think sorry, this is kind of the down, the drawback of transitions. So the reasons why you want to start moving out test execution from your CI/CD pipelines to a tool like Testkube can be multiple. One is just that the execution runtime that your CI/CD tool provides is not fit for running tests at scale, right? Either it's costly or it's slow, right? Or it doesn't give you the kind of controls that you need over configuring the actual execution of your tests. So that's, I think, one common reason that we see, at least with our customers, also open source users, right? They don't want to pay for whatever minutes or whatever they're paying for in the tools that they use. They just run these tests in their infrastructure. The other is around wanting to run tests inside Kubernetes specifically. So once again, infrastructure testing, but also if you're just doing in-cluster testing, let's say you have a microservice that's not exposed to the outside and you don't want to open up ports just to be able to run tests from your CI/CD tool, that could be a reason to let Testkube run those tests for you. The other, I think maybe the biggest one otherwise is having all the results in one place, right? And this maybe speaks more to the commercial offering than the open source offering, but regardless of how, what pipelines and how those tests are triggered, there's one CLI you can go to pull the results for those test executions, right? You don't have to go look at different logs, different build artifacts from different pipeline tools to find the results from those tools. And once again, in the dashboard provided by the commercial version, that's all very visual and more directly appealing. So I think from my experience, at least with our open source customers, I think it's around the scalability aspect. So leveraging Kubernetes to run tests at scale, maybe specifically load testing. And then Also, I think many people are looking for a more Kubernetes native way to manage their tests. So they like the GitOps. And I'm going to get back to GitOps later on. I don't know if that answered the question. Happy to.
That does. That does. So, so Christian, give us a thumbs up if that did, and I also want to continue to encourage people to ask questions. One of the things that I also want to invite the audience to let us know is what are they using Testkube Open Source, if they are using it. Hopefully they are. What are the use cases they're using it for? If they feel comfortable sharing it here in the chat.
I see there's another question there. I'm going to answer that while I'm
at it. Go for it.
What are the clear advantages of a Kubernetes native test orchestration over classic CID combined with the well-established testing framework? So Testkube ultimately runs the well-established testing frameworks, right? So in Testkube uses the Docker images of Playwright, of Cypress, of JMeter, of K6, of Newman, Postman, which is Newman, etc. So we're not we're leveraging the same tools test automation frameworks, right? As long as they can be Dockerized, Testkube can run them for you. So if you're using Playwright today, you'll be continue using the Playwright, probably the same versions that you would. It's just that they'll be running inside Kubernetes, and that execution will be managed by Testkube. You'll see some examples later, and maybe that will make it more imminent. But we're not providing you with our own Playwright execution thing or our own K6 executor. We'll be using the Grafana K6 Docker image and the Microsoft Playwright Docker image, or whatever tool you may be using. So, and we have a lot of users also creating their own Docker images, right, for where they package whatever they might need to run as a test inside their cluster. Okay, I hope that clarifies a little bit. I will get back to it. So now I want to talk about the core resources that Testkube provides, and this is going to get somewhat technical, but I think that's kind of purpose of the webinar also. So there's test workflows and test workflow templates. This is the core abstraction for automated test executions in Testkube. Test triggers are what you define to trigger test workflows based on Kubernetes events. So let's say I want to run a test when something changes in my cluster. That's where I define the test trigger. A webhook is pretty straightforward, right? I want to send a webhook, notify and integrate with some external system when a test passes or fails. That's what I use webhooks for. And these are all defined as CRDs in your cluster. You can manage those with GitOps, all the regular stuff. It's more YAML for better for worse, but they follow all the conventions. These are just CRDs. And you can of course also validate them with admission controllers, which is also pretty common. Okay, let's look a little bit more detail at test workflow. So as I said, test workflows are a core abstraction for how to run a test, a specific test, and it's a YAML vocabulary specifically designed for test execution. You could say it's a workflow engine for test execution, just like Argo Workflows is a more general purpose workflow engine, and there are other workflow engines out there like GitHub Actions. Ours is really has a bunch of constructs and vocabulary very specific for testing and needs of testing tools. I'm going to show you what these look like. But at the high level, each workflow defines content, so where the test itself is. It defines containers, which images to use to run your test. It defines which steps to perform to run that test. You might want to run multiple tests, or you might need to do some steps to first set up something that you'll need in your test. You can, of course, tie into all the kind of low-level Kubernetes aspects of resource limits and pod settings and whatever. However, you might want to kind of make sure that these tests integrate into your Kubernetes infrastructure. You can define artifacts, kind of telling Testkube what to collect from the pod that ran the test when the test is finished. And there's a lot more. This is just really the pure basics. If you go to the documentation at docs.testkube.io, you look for test workflows, you'll see there's a wealth of different low-level vocabulary for testing specifically. Test workflow templates is a way to provide reusable snippets of test workflow definition. So let's say I want to make sure that we're also always using the same container images for running our Playwright tests, or I want to make sure that we always have the same resource limits in place for all our load tests, or I want to make sure that, I don't know, whatever, you get the idea. I can put that in a test workflow template and then use that in my test workflow just to kind of make sure that it's all consistent across all my workflows. So here's maybe what you've been waiting for, more YAML, just to see what it looks like. So this is a very simple example that runs a Postman test. You'll see the kind of regular kind API version metadata, has a label here. It'll specifies a content. This is the Git repository that contains the Postman collection itself. It specifies the container, the working directory in that container, and the resource requests, and then the actual step to run the test. And here you'll see it uses Postman Newman 6 Alpine. So this will be pulled from Docker Hub or whatever. And of course, this could be any Docker image. Testkube makes no constraints on what testing tools you use here. And as I said before, this allows you to basically run any kind of test. The only test we really can't run is iOS simulators. As far as I know, there aren't any for Kubernetes. There are Android simulators that you could run through Testkube. We have examples for that on the website. But you could run chaos tests. You could run whatever. Most tools today are Dockerized in one way or another. And you'll see here, these are the commands that are just then provided to Newman when it's executed. And this will, and I'm going to show you this specific workflow a little bit further down. So just to kind of show what this looks like at a very basic level. So how do you run? If let's say I've created this CRD in my cluster with kubectl apply, you can run it in a bunch of different ways. I can just use the CLI, testkube run. I can specify a schedule in the workflow itself. There wasn't one in this one here, but I could add a spec, what does it say here? Events cron job and set a cron schedule. I can have multiple schedules if I want to run these tests in different times with different parameters. There's a REST API that I could be using to trigger the execution of this workflow, or I could use test triggers, which I'll get to in just a minute. And then going back to CI, CD, this is probably the most common way to run tests today is by that you in your CI/CD pipeline either automate the CLI itself, or use the REST API, make calls. I think by far automating the CLI itself. The CLI itself is, of course, in itself available as a Docker image, which you can easily automate in most any tool today. Okay, and once you run your tests, so maybe one thing that isn't in the slides, what actually happens here is when Testkube is asked to run the test, what it's going to do is that it's going to generate a job and pod that runs the actual test. So it's going to translate this workflow here into actual jobs and pods, which will run, which will then, the pod will have Newman as its main container. There's going to be some init containers in there to help us with capturing logs, etc., etc. But ultimately, it's going to translate that into a job. And if you're quick, you can watch it in your tool just to see as it shows up. And then it'll, once the test is finished, it'll go away. And Testkube will have captured all the output from that very intermediate step. And that's really the only thing that'll put load on your cluster for running the test, those jobs and pods that are generated while the test is running. And there's a pretty low-level document, once again, in the documentation that describes exactly how this works. If you can't find it, just reach out and I'll happy to show you. Okay, getting the results, right? So Testkube automatically collects then the high-level results, pass, fail, how long time it took, that kind of stuff. The log output from the pods itself, those are saved to S3 or min.io in this case, and the artifacts generated by the tests themselves. Like if you're running a playwright test that generates a video or traces or whatever, those could all be captured and then be made available. And then there are CLI commands to, to retrieve those, right? So just getting the executions or getting a specific execution, downloading the artifacts, and then you can view those locally on your machine, or however you might want to process that data. Okay, that's lots to cover, so I'm going to rush it a little bit. I apologize for that. Test triggers is the next main thing. So this is I wanted to share is a test trigger defines how a Kubernetes event can trigger a test workflow execution. So this is a very common scenario in GitOps scenarios and also in infrastructure testing, which I'll get back to a little later. There's basically a test trigger where you define which Kubernetes resources to listen to by name, by kind, by labels, which events to listen for if that resource has been modified or created or updated or whatever, and then which workflows to trigger when that event happens. And that could be a specific workflow, but it could also be a set of workflows by label. So you could say, hey, if this application if this deployment gets updated in my cluster, run all the workflows that have the label application, name of the application, so which could kick off, end-to-end test unit, whatever kind of tests you might want to run against that application. You can also set up conditions and probes that must pass before the workflow is triggered, so you might want to give it some time to settle before the actual execution happens. And the nice thing with, or depends on who you are, with test triggers is that you can't bypass them, right? So regardless of how that deployment gets updated, if it's by kubectl apply or through a GitOps tool, those tests will always kick in. There's no way to really bypass them, which also means that you shouldn't run maybe long-running tests here. Most people run pretty short-running, like safety net kind of tests, just to make sure that nothing bad happened. And then they run the long-running end-to-end tests maybe on a schedule every 2 hours or whatever. Use cases here is GitOps and infrastructure testing, which I'll get back to a little more detail further down the presentation. So this is just what a test trigger looks like. It's pretty simple. This one here will listen to config maps. It's going to listen to one named demo config map in the default namespace. It's going to listen for modified events, and then it's going to run a test workflow called postman sample, which is the one we saw a little bit earlier, which is in the Testkube namespace. So as soon as I apply this resource to my cluster, the Testkube controller is going to start listening for events accordingly and then trigger the execution of this postman sample whenever that config map gets modified. And if the demo gods are with me, we're actually going to see that in action a little bit later. Okay, webhooks, webhook templates. So webhooks, I'm sure you're familiar, allows you to integrate into external tools. And in the Testkube world, that means that whenever a workflow finishes running, that can trigger off a webhook. And of course, the configuration for a webhook is pretty straightforward. It's the URI. Where does it go? Which events should Testkube listen for? So should this be whenever a workflow starts or when it fails? It could also be state change events. So if you want to capture when a workflow goes from failing to not failing, or not failing to failing, so you don't get events for every failure or every pass, just the ones that are actually state changes. You can be further selective on which workflows to listen for. And then, of course, the headers and the payload to send with that webhook. So let's say you want to notify on Slack whenever for example, a test fails, you could set up that. And actually, I'm going to show that also just a little bit later. And there's obviously a lot of you can inject variables into those payloads. There's a bunch of functionality and mechanics around that. Webhook templates, similar to workflow templates, is a way for you to reuse core webhook definitions across multiple webhooks. For example, let's say you have webhooks that create issues in different Jira projects. You could have one core webhook and then a template for that, and then just use the webhooks and with different configuration parameters for the issue type, for the project ID, or whatever else you might want in that specific case. And this is what it looks like. So there's an webhook. It's the regular API version kind. This one's just going to listen for when workflows succeed or fail. It's going to send to this Slack endpoint, and this is the actual payload of the request sent to that payload. And once again, we'll see how that plays out. And if any one of you copies this URL, you're going to be sending webhooks to my private Slack. So I'll see that happening. Okay. Before we jump into a quick demo, I just want to back up and look at some of the use cases. I've touched on them. Why would you use Testkube Open Source? Or kind of what's the use cases? So one is decoupling test execution from CI/CD. Why do you want to do that? Well, one is you want to run tests out of bounds, or you want to run them from multiple pipelines. Pretty common for, let's say you're on Jenkins and you're looking at Argo, right? So how can I trigger the same tests in both of those tools in a consistent way and have all the results in one place? Well, that's Testkube for you. And that's also the next bullet here, and the next one. So it's really about kind of decoupling test execution and results from whatever singular CI/CD tool you might be using today. And how would you do that? Well, you would install the open source agent. That could be either in a testing environment. It could also be an ephemeral environment that you spin up just for a pull request, for example, in GitHub Actions. You would automate the execution of your workflows in that agent with using the CLI or the API, and then you might have a webhook that pushes results into Datadog at the end, where you can then visualize them. Next use case is around GitOps and progressive delivery, also pretty common. Why would you do that? Well, you might want to have some async validation going on if after your reconciliation with your GitOps tool, want to make sure that whatever was deployed is working as it should. Or you might want to do like continuous validation as part of a Canary rollout to validate that the application continues to work as you kind of roll it out to more and more users. And how would you do that? Well, once again, you install the open source agent in your cluster. You can use test triggers that we talked about earlier to trigger on the resource updates. You could also automate the CLI via GitOps mechanics. So for example, in Argo CD, that would be a post-sync hook. You can set up a custom analysis in Argo rollouts, but for Flux, there's also a pattern for how to introduce this. We have this documented once again on our website. And then once again, here you could be pushing results to Grafana or to Datadog. There's a Prometheus endpoint, which I actually forgot to mention, shame on me, that you could also be using to, on Testkube itself, that you could be using to scrape metrics for test executions over time. Finally, I'll touch on infrastructure testing. This is also a very common use case. One being where platform engineering teams want to validate infrastructure before they hand that over to application teams. So let's say you're provisioning a temporary cluster, or a service cluster for someone that needs to build something. You set up that cluster and just want to validate that whatever should be in that cluster works as it should, that all the security, etc., is in place. Another one could be just continuous infrastructure validation as you cluster during the life cycle of the cluster itself. You might be updating cluster components, you might be configuring network policies, you might be doing I don't know what, and you want to make sure that for all changes you want to make sure that the cluster core is still working as it should. And since Testkube runs in your cluster, it's actually pretty good at doing really low-level tests, since it's also a Kubernetes component itself. And so what you might validate here is cluster resources. For example, we have people using cluster for AI workloads. So they've set up, I did mention AI, but it took a while. They set up validations for GPUs to make sure that the cluster is provisioned to have the adequate GPU resources. You can obviously, do curl calls just to make sure you have access to the network endpoints. You could check for Prometheus, Istio, whatever else. How would you do this? Well, you install the Testkube agent in that cluster. You can use test triggers to trigger your tests on configuration changes, or you can just use the CLI automated and CD pipelines to, let's say, as part of your CD process where you create the cluster, you install the agent, you run the CLI to validate everything works, and then you tear everything down afterwards. So you're kind of good to go to hand over that cluster. And as I mentioned, the Testkube marketplace that we have, it's on GitHub. It has a number of ready-to-use workflows to validate core Kubernetes components. So you don't need to write these by yourself, and you can obviously contribute if you've come up with some workflows that are, helpful. You think others could be helped by to validate. I don't know, let's say some database is correctly configured, or we have validation workflows there, I think, for Postgres, Redis, Kafka, and for a bunch of low-level Kubernetes primitives. And we just launched that like a week ago, so we're building it out as we speak. Okay, lots of talk. I'm going to jump quickly over to a short demo. Let's jump over here. I'm just going to go to Lens. So this is just to show you I've installed locally. I'm not going to go through the installation while you watch because it takes time. I've installed it locally in the application. You can see here the API server, MinIO, MongoDB, Nats are all running in the Testkube namespace. You can see the pods here as well. This is kind. And then I also have the custom resources you can see here at the bottom. The webhook template, the test workflow, and then there are some old CRDs here that we've deprecated for now, but we haven't. We weren't really good at our versioning initially, so these are unfortunately going to be sticking around for a while, but we don't support these anymore. So it's test trigger, webhook template, test workflow template, which are the important ones to consider here. And let's jump back to cursor here. So this is just, we can see I don't have any executions here. Let's see if I have any test workflows. Nothing in here, so I guess we could have seen that in Lens as well. So I'm just going to start by, let's start with that Postman example that you saw. So I'm actually going to kubectl apply this. Apply -f Postman. Okay, so this is now being created. I can go get test workflows. You'll see that it's here, and let's also run that. Testkube run test workflow post -f. -f means follow, and now we can see the output of the test running in Testkube. This goes really quickly. So what Testkube actually did under the hood now is that it created a pod which ran this test for you, which first cloned this Git repository. As you can see the clone here. It then pulled the container, which is already on the machine, since I did give this a try before the webinar, and then it ran the test with the commands that were provided here. And here you can see the output from that Postman collection, right? And we have some other samples here. There's a K6 sample. Let's apply that as well. K6 sample, and let's run that. And this one actually haven't run, so that'll be interesting. What happens? So here we go. Now it's pulling the image, and here we go. Oh, this is probably a super short K6 test, but you can see the output from K6 here, etc. And now I can, of course, look at, if we go back in time, get test workflows. I have these two now installed in my cluster. These are the executions that I have. I can now pull the results using this execution ID, and I can add, we have a playwright test, etc. here, where there's more tests to run. But you get the idea. Regardless of what type of test it is, they're kind of applied the same way, they're run the same way. I can interact with them in a consistent way. So what other stuff did we have? We had a trigger, right? So this is the demo trigger that you saw in the slides. It's very simple. It's going to listen to a config map, etc. Let's start by actually creating that config map, which I have here. So once again, kubectl apply -f demo config map. There we go. And then let's also apply the config trigger YAML. So now we have the trigger, and now we have the config map. So in the best of worlds, what would happen now if I modify this config map and save that, and now let's just apply that config map configured, and I'm going to try to find my Slack channel. Here it is. Let me see. Let's see if something happens there. No, sorry. Sorry, my bad. And so let's have a look at the executions. And so what we can see now here is that we have another execution. I jumped ahead of stuff here. I have another execution that was triggered by the update I made here. So I can make another update. Let's change this again and apply that. And then eventually, here we have we can actually see there's an execution running now. And this was the execution triggered by that trigger. Finally, what I wanted to add was the webhook. And so here's the webhook, it's the same that you saw in the slide. Let's also apply that. Demo Testkube webhook. There we go. And now this webhook should be posting to my Slack channel. So whenever I run a test, so let's just once again modify that config map. Save it. And apply. Okay, so you can see that the execution is running, and I'm keeping an eye on Slack over here. yeah, I'll just pull it into the screen. You'll see here that this was the Slack notification I got here just a little while ago. So as you can see, pretty straightforward. I was able to, it was really easy. I mean, obviously practiced, but it was pretty straightforward to run different types of tests, to get those tests triggered, and to notify into Slack for this specific test. Happy to share if anyone's interested in this repo. I don't think it's available, but if anyone's interested. Okay, that was a very, very short demo. Let's go back to the slides. We're almost out of time. Okay, great. So one thing, if you've been keeping an eye on Testkube, you might have seen a flurry of activities on commercial. And you're wondering, okay, but are these guys really investing in open source? And of course we are, right? So a lot of, given the duality of the nature of our product, many of the improvements and changes we make are directly in the open source core, which means they're also been available to open source users. So just last week, we released a possibility to have input-out parameters between workflows. We've added execution timeouts, so you can define more granular timeouts for the execution of your workflows. Postgres support is something that we've added just recently, obviously also available to open source users. Action parameters for test triggers, workflow marketplace, as I've mentioned. All these things, a lot of things that we're adding are available to our open source users. And also, if you go to our Testkube repo on GitHub, you'll see that just over the last month, we've received both bug reports, which is we really appreciate, but also small feature requests from users that we have implemented and added to the product. So we're definitely open for improving the open source experience, either by as a collateral as we improve commercial, but also just for the sake of open source without kind of maybe direct benefit to the commercial platform. Looking ahead, what are we improving specifically for open source, or not specifically, but things that will improve the open source experience? So test workflow debugging is something that we'd like to be able to do to suspend and resume a workflow with multiple steps as it executes. We're adding field selectors to test triggers, so allowing you to not trigger, as you saw for this config map demo, that test executed for any change to the config map. You might want to trigger on just specific fields. We're going to provide you with a way to retrieve the execution history of your webhooks and your test triggers, which today is not really doable. We're integrating the marketplace into the CLI, so you'll be able to browse the marketplace from the CLI and also pull workflows into your local environment from the marketplace just using the CLI. And we're, of course, looking into how to integrate, oops, Claude, missing an E, sorry about that, how to integrate Testkube into those tools using skills or other approaches. And of course, anything you ask for, right? So obviously always super interested in hearing more about what you want. We're a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to skim through this. Testkube Open Source is primarily MIT licensed, and what that means is that there's some code in the open source agent that is not under the MIT license, but that is related to connection with the commercial control plane and functionality through the control plane. But the bulk of it is MIT licensed. It's a dual licensing similar to other open source products. Get in touch, or you can use either GitHub issues. Of course, we have a community Slack channel. Always we'd love to talk to people and hear kind of how they're using it, what could be better, and how it can be better, what hurdles they're facing, and also questions like we had earlier on the webinar. Why would I use this? I'm happy with GitHub Actions, and probably for a good reason. So doesn't. There's interest. It's always interesting for us to hear kind of those discussions. The Testkube repo itself has a bunch of our resources to help you. So there's a contributor guideline, there's an architecture guide, a development guide to show you how to use Tilt for local development workflow of open source. So Tilt makes it super easy to run the open source agent locally from the code itself, and as you make changes to the code, Tilt will automatically redeploy those changes. So if you want to try out some stuff, it's very, very fluid, sorry, to kind of do that. We really try to make an effort to make it easy to contribute to that code base. There are also design guidelines, and there's an agentsmd file if you want to use AI to generate code or whatever. Of course, welcome to that. We're still going to review it, and we're going to ask AI to review it as well. So we're all in the same boat. And I mentioned the Tilt file. I'm not going to do that demo because it takes a little while and we're a little bit short on time, and I want to also maybe answer some questions. But if you're super interested in this and would like a demo, please reach out. Okay, now what? If you've kind of been patient enough, hopefully you'll be intrigued to go over to Testkube.io. You can check out the docs, the repos on GitHub, join our Slack channel, download the CLI, run Testkube in it, and get testing. And I think that's all there is to it.
That is great, Ole, and right on time. 4 minutes for Q&A.
4 minutes.
But that's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing all that cool information. And we have some articles as well that I want you to go and explore. I put some in the comments. So there is, I'm sorry, in the chat. At some point during the presentation, you mentioned about workflows. So there is their link for the workflow documents as well. And if you want to learn more about what is the latest things that we have launched into the Testkube platform, you can go ahead and read the article that I put in there as well. He has all the cool stuff about the workflow marketplace as well. So there's a video in there that you can follow and see how it works. We have Ole, I don't know if you want to go ahead and navigate to the Q&A section there. I believe you answered most of them, but there are a couple of new questions at the bottom. Okay. We talked about the clear advantages, and then I believe we also talked about drawing the line between CI/CD pipelines and examples. And there's another one that
does Testkube emit a stable webhook event schema for failed executions, logs, artifacts to unit, that third-party ACL tools. So the webhook can contain links back to retrieving the artifacts, and the artifacts would include the JUnit result file. So the payload itself will not contain the JUnit results or the artifacts, because they could be large, I guess. But the payload will contain links to retrieve those. So I think that's kind of the approach we've seen people do, where they have a webhook that goes to, for example, Datadog, and in Datadog they have a script that then extracts those links and uses those to fetch the artifacts from the execution, and then parses and pushes them into Datadog for visualization. I will say that another great way to process this output today is with AI tooling, which is fantastic at analyzing logs and helping you troubleshoot your tests. Do it either with our commercial offering or with any other tool out there. It's just AI is really good at this kind of stuff. So it's just
great. All right, and I think that covers it all. So before we all go, I want to remind you, as I said at the beginning, we have another webinar coming up in May 7th. So that's about 3 weeks from now. So keep an eye on the invites that you will get, the newsletter. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter, please let us know. We'll be more than happy to add you there, so you can get all the news about Testkube. Ole, I want to thank you for all the great information that you shared today.
My pleasure.
Happy to have you here, and the audience as well. Thank you so much for your time and for being here. Please stay in touch with us, and go visit Testkube at the GitHub repo. Also, as Ole said, join the Slack channel. I personally am always posting stuff in there for you guys to read, or any new material that we create. So last but not least, go ahead and check out our resources. This is going to be available on demand, and also we have more events coming up, so keep an eye on that. Ole, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And please, folks, reach out. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find me on LinkedIn, and we'll connect there.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Ole. You are the audience. We are Testkube, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Yeah, have a good day. Bye.
Stay healthy, stay safe. Bye-bye.